name is Bob Filner. I'm a congressman, but I'm also a candidate. That is, I'm running for mayor of San Diego, and I can tell you about that. And I'm going to read a book that I know because I know the person who wrote it, and I know the person she wrote it about, her father. It's called Child of the Civil Rights Movement by Paula Young Shelton and Raul Colon. Do you know what the Civil Rights Movement is, by the way? You answered first last time, so I want to get someone else who answered first this time, okay? Yeah, fair rights for everybody. Did you want to say something? Who had their hand up back here? What were you going to say? I didn't hear you. Make laws fair, yeah. And what were you going to say? So same rights for everybody. And then I started to say, you know, there was a time in this country, 50 years ago maybe, in my lifetime, when if you were not white, that is, if you were African American or Latino or Asian, or you even looked different, you could not go to the same school as white kids did. Does that sound fair? No. You couldn't even, you know, they couldn't even drink out of the same water fountain. There was a water fountain, there was two water fountains, say, outside. One said white, only white kids could drink, and one said colored, that is everybody who wasn't. Does that sound?
One was 30, the white.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that terrible?
Yes,
So the civil rights movement said we should be fair, we should have everybody equal opportunity. But we had to fight for those, to make those laws different. And one of the big civil rights leaders was named Andrew Young. He was a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King's. And this Paula Young is a daughter of Andrew Young. I happen to know Andrew Young very well. He's still alive. He worked with Dr. King. He was with him when Dr. King was assassinated, was killed.
40 years ago.
How many?
40 years ago.
40 years? Is that right? 43 years. It's already 43 years ago. He was assassinated in 1968. That's more than 43 years ago. But he was with Dr. King, and then he later he was elected to Congress, and I worked for him in Congress when he was in Washington. Then he became ambassador to the United Nations, and then he became mayor of Atlanta, and he's still alive, so I know him. I also met Dr. King when I was 13 years old, so I know some of the people that she's writing about. So I'm going to read you about how she grew up in this family devoted to civil rights. And she talks about Dr. King in here as Uncle Martin. So I'm going to read you about what she thought about Uncle Martin. And this is how she, you know, what it was like growing up, where you look, if you were an African American young student and you saw a sign that said whites only, wouldn't that, what would you feel if you saw that sign?
Disappointed.
Disappointed? Mad. You get angry. Frustrated?
Wow,
You know these big words, wow. I didn't hear you. Offended. Yeah, yeah, you would be, because why couldn't you go there, right?
Dreadful.
I didn't hear it.
Dreadful.
Dreadful? Yeah. You might feel, by the way, some kids, sometimes you don't feel this way, but if something was set aside for somebody, they say they're better than you are. You might not feel as good as them at first. And then you get angry that, no, I'm the same, right? But some people felt that maybe, you know, they felt that they weren't as good as them. That's what's, with this system that separates whites and non-whites is called segregation. That means separation. Segregation. Right, separated. And sometimes that makes people feel not just mad and angry, but and they're frustrated, but they feel maybe inferior. I'm not as good as them. And that's a real bad thing about segregation, because we're all equal, right? We're all can do things. Okay, this is called Child of the Civil Rights Movement, and is a young lady who grew up with a family. And it says here, the first chapter is called Going Home. It said, Mama was from Alabama. That's a state in the United States. Daddy was from Louisiana, the deep south, in the southern part of our country. They had been called bad names, treated badly, told you can't do that, just because of the color of their skin. They grew up with Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a title that means laws that said black people had to sit in the back of the bus, the last car of the train, the balcony of the movie theater, laws that said black people couldn't vote. I was born in New York, says Paula, where there was no Jim Crow. But one day when Mom and Daddy were watching the news, they saw something called the Freedom Riders. Black and white students riding buses together from the north to the south to protest the bad laws. See, if there's a law that was bad, how do you change the law? Well, freedom rides was one thing, but what you do, and this may sound strange to you, you break the law, but you don't run away like a criminal does. You know, when someone steals something, they run away. You go to jail to say, I'm willing to take the consequences of this law, and then you try to change the law. In fact, I was one of the Freedom Riders, and I spent time in jail to protest the law. But because we went to jail, they changed the law to change it. What? I'm sorry. What are you going to ask? You can ask me. Anyway, if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to ask. They saw something called the Freedom Riders, black and white students riding buses together from the north to the south to protest the bad laws. They watched as racists, that is the people who thought that whites and blacks should be separated, pulled the students from their seats and set the buses on fire. We have to go to help, my father exclaimed. We have to go home, my mother declared. So the parents said, we have got to help. When I saw that bus being burned, that's what I said. I said, I have to go and help. So this is what her family looked like. So Mom and Daddy packed up their 3 little girls, Andrea, Lisa, and me. I'm not sure if she's the others. And we went back to Georgia, back to Jim Crow, where whites could but blacks could not. Back to the heart of the civil rights movement. That's pretty brave to go back to where they were discriminated against instead of just living the way they wanted to. This is called my first protest. In our new home in Atlanta, Jim Crow was everywhere. At first I thought Jim Crow was a big black crow that squawked whenever a black person tried to get a good seat. Caw, caw, you can't sit there. But really he was a white man who lived long ago. He painted his face black and made fun of African Americans. He didn't sound very nice to me. I guess that's why they named the laws after him, because they weren't very nice either. Despite Jim Crow, a few restaurants had opened where blacks and whites could eat together. One Sunday, Mommy and Daddy decided to see how far things had really come. So after church, they're going to church here, at the brand new Holiday Inn restaurant. So after church, we went to have brunch at the brand new Holiday Inn restaurant. I guess they're leaving church here and coming to the restaurant. We stepped into the fancy lobby with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and we asked for a table, but they wouldn't let us in. We looked at all the empty tables with all the white tablecloths and the few white faces that stared at us in horror. All we wanted was to sit down and eat. I was so hungry that I started crying. Here's, I guess, Paula right here. She's crying. But they wouldn't let us in. Can you see the pictures? My baby. I'm sorry. I can't read and see the pictures at the same time, though. My baby's hungry, Mama said, while I kept crying louder and louder. Mom and Daddy didn't try to stop it. They simply sat me down and let me cry. And did I ever? I screamed at the top of my lungs. My very first protest. My own little sit-in, but they still wouldn't let us in. This is called Uncle Martin. Who do you think that's? Yeah, did you ever see him in a t-shirt like that?
No.
Uncle Martin had a big, broad smile and eyes that twinkled. Come here, girl, he'd say, whenever our families would meet. At one of the only pools for African Americans in Atlanta, the Ollie Street YMCA. Oh, he's in a swimming suit, that's all. Are you ready to get in that water and teach me how to swim? See, she called Dr. King Uncle Martin. Run, I would run as fast as my skinny little legs would carry me. Run and leap, leap into his wide open arms and fly, fly as he threw me high into the air. No, I would scream and laugh, my arms clasped tightly around his neck as he pretended to throw me in. But Uncle Martin wasn't really my uncle, not by blood anyway. We were close because our fathers worked together, close because our mothers worried together, close because we all struggled together, close because we were brought together for a common goal, a common good. We were one family, the family of the American Civil Rights Movement. I'm going to tell you what, I want you guys at some point to read the rest of this book. You think you could do that? Because it's a story about how Uncle Martin and her father worked together to make the Civil Rights Movement successful. This all happened about 1961, they're talking about now. It's more than 50 years ago. And Dr. King was killed in 1968, 7 years later. So this is about those 7 years as she was growing up and learned about all the heroes of the Civil Rights Movement. So I want you to read this and then write me a little letter about what you learned. You think you could do that? I'm going to leave my address with your teachers. And I want to say what you learned from Paula Young as she wrote this, okay? Any questions? Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
When you met Martin Luther King,
I'm sorry?
when you met Martin Luther King, what year was it?
It was 1955. He just was becoming well known as a great speaker. He was living in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was his first real job as a minister. So he hadn't really become famous yet. Yes, sir.
How did you feel to meet Martin Luther King?
Well, you know, I was only 13 at the time. I didn't know that he was going to be famous. But he was very impressive. I followed his career, you know, after that, and he taught me about nonviolence, how to act in a very peaceful way toward other people. So I adopted that philosophy because of him. And I marched with him later, and I went to jail with him after that. So I got to know him. But he was a very, very human man, even though he was later famous. You know. Go ahead. The I Have a Dream speech, do you know that speech? Very
Yeah.
famous? That was in 1963. That was his only major speech I ever missed. Because I was traveling, I was in another country. So I didn't see that speech. But I mean, wasn't there, but I've seen it on you know, television and films. And almost once a week, I go to the place where he made that speech at the Lincoln Monument in Washington. It's a very inspiring place in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Abraham Lincoln, where he made that speech. So, have I ever made new laws? Yes, all the time. That's my job. So I vote on laws almost every day when I'm in Washington, and I write some of them. Let me give you an example of the law that I wrote. Let's see. You know, when young people have to go and fight wars that we are involved in, like Iraq, when they come back, they're called veterans. And sometimes those veterans need medical help. They want to go to college maybe, or they need a job. I've written laws that help those veterans get jobs and education and medical care. So that's the kind of laws I write. Okay. Yes, sir.
What are one of the newest songs that you read?
One of the newest ones? Well, that was one of the laws about helping our veterans, that is those who have fought our wars for us, to go to college, to help them get the money to go to college. That's one of the most recent laws I wrote. just scratches. Thank you very much, guys. Nice to meet you all. I want you to read the book and write me a letter about it, okay? Okay, thank you.
Let's hear applause for this.
Thank you, guys.
I want to thank Congressman Filner
Take
for
care.
coming also.